On this program, we've been talking quite a bit lately about the confusion that is Syria. For anybody who's been under a rock, here's a quick recap. Last month, President Trump abruptly announces that U.S. troops may be pulled out of that war-torn country ASAP. Mission accomplished. Take a listen.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
To say that caught those closest in his administration off guard, would put it politely. Very soon after that abrupt announcement, Defense Secretary James Mattis announced his resignation in a very dramatic way. Then, over this past weekend, National Security Advisor John Bolton said the withdrawal would be conditional. ISIS would have to be defeated before troops are pulled out. That directly contradicted his boss, the president. Now, the whole mess has exposed a bigger issue. The State Department is way understaffed and in many cases underinformed. Here's how The Atlantic describes the situation. Quote, almost half of the top-level jobs in the State Department are still empty almost 2 years into the administration. That includes ambassadors. The Trump administration fired dozens of its foreign policy gardeners, otherwise known as ambassadors, and has been slow to get new ones into the field. It shouldn't be surprised when the result is not a garden, but a jungle. Joining me now, former State Department official and Obama campaign foreign policy advisor, David Tafuri. David, sounds silly, but in Vice, the new movie out, and I know there's artistic liberties taken, but Dick Cheney's scene basically is creating foreign policy and all kinds of policy on his own in a vacuum. In a bizarre way, after I heard Bolton talk, and as frightening as it is that Bolton is the voice of reason in any conversation, nonetheless, who's actually making policy? I'm not even being a wise guy. Do we even know that Bolton and the president are on the same page on this? That there's been any coordination with DOD, state, or anyone else? Who's deciding what?
Well, we see this happening over and over again with President Trump and his administration, especially in the foreign policy arena. So what you've correctly described has happened is that President Trump made this sudden announcement that we were going to quickly withdraw our special forces from Syria. Most of his administration, if not all of his administration, certainly all of his top foreign policy and military advisors were against that decision, and they were caught off guard. We saw Secretary Mattis resign, and several other top Pentagon officials have resigned, including even yesterday, the chief of staff to the Pentagon just resigned over this issue. So we have Bolton now trying to walk this back, sort of softly, although it wasn't that soft, because he had this dust-up now with President Erdogan. And part of the problem with this decision when President Trump made it is that precipitously pulling out our forces will leave the Syrian Kurds, who we have been partnered with, all alone and possibly subject to an attack by Turkey.
So we don't know the who. Now we get to the how, and you've forgotten more than I know as it relates to international relations, but the folks that I know that have served in other administrations, the arrogance of somebody like me who's never served in a consulate abroad, that hasn't cultivated relationships, that doesn't know the situation on the ground, the various players and the cultures and everything else involved, that somebody's just going to come in from 10,000 feet without even reading a briefing book and decide the geopolitical landscape of the world without any consultation or any process of including his own agencies or even bringing in people that are on the ground or even staffing those positions. It's crazy, and this isn't Republican or Democrat. Can you explain to people at home that you can't just walk in and decide you know better than anybody and by your gut decide how the world operates? It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. This is not normal. CEOs don't make decisions about this with respect to their companies. When they make a decision, they make the decision once they're fully informed, they study the issues. But we're talking about something so much more important, really, than just the running of one company, just the business management of a company. We're talking about America the most powerful, strongest nation in the world, and our foreign policy, and which way we're going to steer this ship. And President Trump has suddenly steered it in a different direction, not only a different direction than the past administrations, but a different direction than his own closest top advisors are telling him to do. And apparently he's done it with very little information. He did it very soon after he had a one-on-one talk with President Erdogan. President Erdogan apparently influenced him to make this decision. But the question is this the right decision for America? Is this the right decision for our other allies? And all of the information and data suggests it isn't. But President Trump hasn't apparently studied that data. To make matters worse, President Trump recently went to Iraq, which was nice. It's good. It was his first visit to Iraq. He went and visited our forces on the ground in Iraq, which is great. But he spent so little time there and really had so little apparent interest that he didn't meet even with the government officials of the government of Iraq. He made no time to do that. He could have learned more about the situation in Iraq and in Syria if he used that visit to as an informative visit rather than just a photo op with our troops, which was nice, but it's not enough for the president to be an informed decision maker.
We talk, and certainly it's not just us, anyone who's seen some of the reporting from among others, Bob Woodward and the rest, about the lack of curiosity and the lack of information. But also, David, there's the question about bad information. How scary was it what the president said about the history of Russia and Afghanistan? I mean, completely wrong, but more than being wrong, it seemed like it was like a memo straight from Russian state-owned media here about rewriting why Russia was in Afghanistan, etc. There's a legitimate question as to who's getting the president information that he's then using to create policy.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because that showed that he's massively uninformed about a recent historical event in which Russia was involved, and America was involved too, of course, because we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that ultimately helped defeat Russia there. But there's also a really important lesson to be learned from what happened with Afghanistan, which is we helped support forces on the ground that fought against Russia. And then after Russia was defeated in Afghanistan, we pulled out completely. We didn't stay involved in Afghanistan. And that's how we ended up with the Taliban. And then after the Taliban, of course, we had al-Qaeda hosted by the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's how al-Qaeda was able to attack us. So there was a really important lesson to be learned from Afghanistan, and it is relevant to today. But President Trump, because he didn't understand what happened really with Afghanistan, he's actually completely misconstrued it the other way around. Finally,
Macron said, and I think he's speaking for a lot of European leaders concerned where Russia all of a sudden might look at the Ukraine and say, well, who's going to stop us? How much of a real ally are they to the U.S., given, as you mentioned before, what we basically leave the Kurds hanging and other allies that maybe they don't pay in enough? Macron talked about maybe they need to have a European military force. A broader question, finally, David, how much longer can this go on for without there being not just, marks, but permanent scars as it relates to the U.S., its role in the world, how our word will be taken seriously by allies and even enemies? Can it go on for another couple years and then hopefully somebody else is there that'll right the ship? How concerned are you that unscheduled events might happen that we're going to look back on and say, we didn't have the luxury of time like some of us think? I mean, I think there are already permanent scars, unfortunately. The Middle East is becoming more and more of a mess. There's no certainty as to what the U.S. position is on key issues in the Middle East, key countries in the Middle East. As you mentioned, with respect to Ukraine, it's not exactly clear what President will do there from day to day. He's made, some good decisions in terms of providing lethal weapons to the Ukrainians who are fighting against an incursion by Russia and by Russian-supported separatists in eastern Ukraine. But that could really heat up.
and we don't know whether Trump will make the right decisions. So Macron and the other European leaders are right to be thinking about what are they going to do independent of the U.S. to continue to hold the values that we in the West feel are important, to supporting democracy, to supporting human rights, to supporting the NATO alliance. We already have permanent scars from this. Our allies are already looking away from the U.S., looking for other role models, for other alliances. It has diminished the influence of the U.S. That's not what President Trump intended, but it is what is happening.
David, I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, it's been a pretty heavy hour so far, so let's downshift a little bit and go to a lighter topic, the Oscars. Well, the controversy over Kevin Hart continues as the Academy says it's now open to having the comedian host, but the backlash of what Hart had to say, specifically the homophobic comments, continues. We're going to take a look at how this all could and should play out.